Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm over the moon to announce that the latest update to Total War The Dawnless Days dropped. Well, it is true that I'm quite a bit late with this video. I've had a lot of stuff going on in my personal life that, while putting this video on hold, has never reduced my excitement to make this video. If you're new here, The Dawnless Days is a mod for Total War Attila, completely overhauling the game and setting it in the third age of Middle-earth. With its most recent update, the mod is at version 0.6.1 and is inching ever closer to completion, with this update being so large that I'm going to be making several videos on it. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. We've been waiting almost a year for this update, and it's such a relief to finally have it and experience it. With that said, we're going to hop into the changes made to the mod. To begin with, a new mode has been added to the game, War of the Ring, that allows you to play historical scenarios in universe. As it currently stands, the only scenario available is the Battle of the Five Armies, which is inspired primarily by the film version of the battle. I'd love to play it with you guys, however it doesn't allow battle replay, so it would have to be a live battle instead if I do it with commentary over the top. Personally, I can't wait for more scenarios to be added in, although I do plan on creating some for myself based off of both the books and the films. Apart from the scenarios being added, many new maps have been added, most prominently of all being Isengard, which makes for quite an imposing map to play on. In upcoming videos I look forward to showing off those maps and how well they go with massive armies clashing. Moving on from these changes, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the factions themselves, covering the changes that certain factions have received, although Erebor, the faction that received a massive overhaul, will be getting its own video. We'll begin funnily enough with the Goblins and their onagers. While previously the troops crewing these weapons had been Orc rabble, they've been changed to now be Goblins, better reflecting the faction that the unit finds itself in. Looking at the Goblins, they're equipped much the same as the Goblin Scrappers, being mostly unarmoured and wearing ragged clothes and hoods, their only uniform armour being their very spiky pollens, which protect their knees. Overall, while it makes sense for artillery crews to be lightly armed given they're not expected to see combat, knee protection over helmets is an odd choice, but one that we'll roll with. In terms of weapons, the Goblins have curved blades at their side reminiscent of the ancient Greek coppers, great for slashing and hacking. Overall, while not the most attention-grabbing unit, it's good to see attention being taken to go over and correct minor errors. With this unit covered, we'll move on to the next faction that has seen changes occur to its roster, Imladris. The main unit to see change here are the Noldor and Rangers, who now have a unit cap on their recruitment, a max strength of 3 now being their limit. Previously the unit had no restrictions, which for a faction bereft of units, meant that with what was available, flexibility could still be attained, with bow cavalry being a viable option. Now, however, the unit can't be relied on to be a potential core of an army, and instead is now relegated to a support role. This change being an indication, in my opinion, that the Imladris roster will be having quite an update in the future, building towards its intended game plan. Moving on to the next faction which has seen change as a result of this update, we have Isengard. To begin with, Isengard has seen its Mordor rabble unit change, going from a melee infantry unit to a spear unit. Looking at the warriors, they wear much the same eclectic collection of rags and battered armour, using a mix of metal bucklers and wooden bucklers with metal rims embossed in conjunction with what can only be described as glaives rather than spears, every orc in the unit using the same weapon. While I don't mind the glaive design, which is good for both slashing and stabbing, the uniformity of the weapons is odd given that this is meant to be a rabble unit using cobbled together equipment. I'm of two minds when it comes to this. Perhaps the modders are planning on diversifying their weapons in upcoming updates, or these guys use uniform weapons due to being under the control of Saruman, as opposed to Sauron. The change from swordsman to spearman has had quite a bit of an impact on the unit apart from visually, as it means its role has changed significantly, as has the way it will be used from now on. While the unit is more capable of fending off cavalry, which were previously almost a win button when facing off with Mordor rabble, it now means that the unit is less useful offensively, although with that said, even when they were swordsmen they were still quite lacking. Overall, an interesting change that has also been replicated in the Mordor faction by its respective rabble unit, although we'll get to that later on. Moving on to the other change Isengard has seen, the half-orc units, both the spears and the axes have seen some design changes, with both units now no longer wearing red clothes under their armour, changing to green and brown instead. With that said, Isengard has been covered, so we'll move on to the next faction, Mordor. Looking at the orc rabble, they too have made the change to spearmen, which means Mordor for now actually lacks offensive infantry in the early game, perhaps suggesting that more units will be added in the next mod update to fill out its ranks, or meaning that early game Mordor is meant to be somewhat defensive until large numbers of warriors can be assembled. Before moving on to the next faction change, I will say that because this unit also uses the same glaive uniformly, it gives credence to the idea that the weapon is just a placeholder for now until future updates arrive. Going to the next change from Mordor, a new unit, the Orc Spears have been added. These silver tier 2 heavy spear infantry are the spear equivalent of the Orc warriors, wearing the exact same black armour and clothes as that unit, while using the same variety of shields in conjunction with the glaives we've seen previously. For armour, the unit uses a mix of different elaborate helmets with spikes and horns, brigandines, spolders, and vambraces to provide some protection. Overall, with the addition of these guys plus the Orc rabble change, it means that Mordor has a somewhat robust spear line all the way from the early game to the late game, helping to round out the faction and make it somewhat less vulnerable to shock cavalry, and improving its ability to play when on the defensive. Finally, with these guys covered, we'll move on to the last faction to receive changes, the Woodland Realm. Overall, the change made to the Woodland Realm is far more minor, but I feel it important to take note of regardless. The Forest Rangers fielded by the faction have gone from being a tier 2 unit to a tier 3 unit, meaning that the unit is no longer really a go-to for mid-game armies, nor should it ever have been. This change also indicating to me that regular archers will be added to the Woodland Realm along with some other units sometime soon, as long as the modders don't make us wait another year for an update. With all this said, I think I've covered all the changes I could take notice of in this update. If any of you guys know of any others, please let me know in the comments below. I'd really appreciate it. Before I end the video, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. I know it might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it really means the world. The next video coming up should be looking at the overhaul of the Erebor roster, so if you're looking forward to that, just stick around. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.